The clock on the wall showed 7:30 p.m. when Karoline Leavitt stepped out of her black sedan in front of the elegant townhouse in Georgetown. The winter air in Washington, D.C. was crisp, and she pulled her coat tighter as she walked up the brick steps. After months of non-stop work, press conferences, and late nights at the office, she finally had an evening away from the chaos. Tonight was different. No cameras, no reporters, no prepared statements. Just a small dinner party hosted by longtime friends who worked in government. The kind of gathering where people could actually be themselves instead of their job titles. Karoline rang the doorbell and heard footsteps approaching. The door opened to reveal Tom Richardson, a policy advisor she had known for years. His face lit up with a genuine smile. "Karoline, so glad you could make it. We weren't sure you'd be able to get away from work. Honestly, I almost didn't," she admitted, stepping inside the warm house. "But I realized I haven't had a real conversation with friends in months. Everything lately has been about work, deadlines, and crisis management." The house felt like a breath of fresh air. Soft lighting, comfortable furniture, and the smell of home-cooked food filled the air. It was the opposite of the sterile government buildings where she spent most of her time. Tom led her into the living room, where about 8 other people were already gathered. Some she recognized from various government departments, others were new faces. Everyone seemed relaxed, holding wine glasses and engaged in actual conversations rather than the political small talk that usually dominated her social interactions. "Let me introduce you to everyone," Tom said, guiding her around the room. "You know Patricia from the Treasury Department, and this is her husband David, who works in education policy." Karoline shook hands and exchanged pleasantries, genuinely interested in meeting people outside her usual circle. For the first time in weeks, she felt her shoulders relax. "And over here is Kash Patel," Tom continued, leading her to a man standing by the fireplace. "He's been doing incredible work in his current position." Kash turned from his conversation and extended his hand with a warm smile. He was younger than she expected, with kind eyes and an easy manner that immediately put her at ease. "Nice to finally meet you, Karoline. I've heard great things about your work. Tom's been trying to get us together for months." "The feeling is mutual," she replied. "Though I have to admit, between our crazy schedules, I wasn't sure this would ever happen." They chatted briefly about their work, but Karoline was struck by how Kash seemed more interested in her as a person than her professional achievements. He asked about her background, her family, and what brought her to Washington in the first place. "Dinner is ready," Tom's wife called from the dining room, and the group moved toward a beautifully set table. The meal was delicious, and the conversation flowed naturally. People shared stories about their lives, their families, and experiences that had nothing to do with politics. Karoline found herself laughing more than she had in months. She sat across from Kash at the table and noticed how he listened intently when others spoke. He asked thoughtful questions and seemed genuinely interested in everyone's stories. There was something refreshing about his approach to conversation. "You know," said Patricia, cutting into her chicken, "this is exactly what I needed. Sometimes I forget there's life outside the office." "I was just thinking the same thing," Karoline agreed. "I've been so focused on work lately that I feel like I've lost touch with everything else." "What do you mean?" asked David, leaning forward with interest. Karoline paused, surprised by her own honesty. "I don't know. I got into this work because I wanted to make a difference, to help people. But somewhere along the way, it became just about getting through each day, managing one crisis after another. I feel like I've lost sight of why I'm doing this in the first place." The table grew, quiet not from awkwardness but from recognition. Several people nodded in understanding. "I think we all go through that," said Kash quietly. "The work is important, but it can consume you if you're not careful. Sometimes you have to step back and remember what really matters." "Easy to say, harder to do," Karoline replied with a small smile. "When you're in the middle of it all, everything feels urgent and important." "That's true," Kash acknowledged. "But I've learned that if you don't have something to anchor you, something deeper than the job itself, you can get lost in all the noise." There was something in his tone that made Karoline look at him more carefully. He wasn't speaking as a colleague offering professional advice. There was personal experience behind his words. As the evening continued, the conversation moved from topic to topic. They talked about movies, travel, books they had read, and places they wanted to visit. It was the kind of relaxed dialogue that Karoline had been craving without realizing it. She noticed that Kash contributed to every conversation but never dominated them. He had opinions but listened to others. He was confident but not arrogant. There was a steadiness about him that she found appealing. "I have to ask," she said during a lull in the conversation. "How do you stay so calm? Working in government can be incredibly stressful, but you seem so centered." Kash smiled and took a sip of his wine. "I wasn't always this way. I went through some really difficult times when I was younger, times when I questioned everything about my life and my purpose." The table grew quiet again, sensing that Kash was about to share something personal. "I learned that if you don't have something bigger than yourself to believe in, the pressure can break you. For me, finding that anchor changed everything." Karoline felt a stirring of curiosity. She had been struggling with exactly what he was describing. The pressure, the questions about purpose, the feeling of being lost in the chaos of daily responsibilities. "What kind of anchor?" she asked, genuinely interested. Kash looked thoughtful for a moment, as if deciding how much to share. "I guess it comes down to faith. Not necessarily religious faith, though that's part of it for me. But faith in something larger than the political games we play every day." The conversation could have become uncomfortable at that point. Faith and politics were topics that often led to heated debates. But something about Kash's manner kept the atmosphere peaceful and open. "I don't talk about it much at work," he continued, "but having that foundation helps me remember that the people we serve aren't just voters or statistics. They're human beings with real struggles and real hopes." Karoline found herself hanging on every word. This was exactly the kind of perspective she'd been searching for without knowing it. As the evening wound down and people began to say their goodbyes, Karoline realized she hadn't checked her phone once in over 3 hours. For someone who was usually glued to her device, constantly monitoring news and messages, this felt like a small miracle. Walking to her car, she reflected on the evening. Something about the conversation with Kash had touched a part of her that had been dormant for months. His words about having an anchor, about remembering the human element in their work, resonated deeply. She drove home through the quiet streets of Washington, her mind still processing the evening's conversations. For the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful that there might be more to her work than just surviving each day's challenges. The dinner party had been exactly what she needed, though she hadn't realized it when she arrived. Sometimes the most important moments happen when you're not looking for them. In conversations with people who remind you of what really matters in life. 2 weeks passed after that dinner party, and Karoline found herself thinking about it more often than she expected. The conversation with Kash had stayed with her, especially his words about having an anchor in life. She couldn't shake the feeling that he understood something important that she was still searching for. When Tom called to invite her to another small gathering, this time at his lake house outside the city, she didn't hesitate to say yes. The idea of getting away from Washington for a weekend felt like exactly what she needed. The drive to the lake house took about 2 hours, and Karoline used the time to clear her head. She rolled down the windows, played her favorite music, and, for the first time in weeks, she wasn't thinking about work deadlines or the next crisis that might need her attention. The lake house was beautiful and peaceful. It sat right on the water with large windows that looked out over the calm lake. Pine trees surrounded the property and the air smelled fresh and clean. It was the perfect escape from the concrete and chaos of the city. When she arrived, she found the same group from the dinner party plus a few new faces. Everyone seemed more relaxed here than they had been in the city. People were wearing casual clothes, sitting on the deck, and actually enjoying themselves without constantly checking their phones. Kash was there too, and he greeted her with the same warm smile she remembered. He was wearing a simple sweater and jeans, and somehow looked even more approachable than he had at the formal dinner. "How was the drive?" he asked as she joined a small group on the deck overlooking the water. "Perfect," she replied honestly. I forgot how good it feels to just drive without any destination except relaxation. They spent the afternoon talking, walking around the property, and enjoying the kind of unhurried conversation that's only possible when you have nowhere else to be. As evening approached, Tom started a fire in the outdoor fire pit, and everyone gathered around with blankets and warm drinks. The setting was magical. The fire crackled softly. The lake reflected the last light of the day, and stars were beginning to appear in the clear sky. It felt like they were a million miles away from their usual world of meetings and deadlines. "This reminds me of when I was a kid," said Patricia, pulling her blanket closer around her shoulders. "My family used to go camping every summer. Some of my best childhood memories happened around campfires like this." "Same here," agreed David. "There's something about sitting around a fire that makes people want to share stories. Maybe it's something deep in human nature." The conversation naturally turned to childhood memories and family stories. People shared funny moments, embarrassing situations, and the kind of personal experiences that rarely come up in professional settings. Karoline found herself opening up about her own childhood, telling stories about growing up with her siblings and the dreams she had as a young girl. It felt good to remember that version of herself, the one who believed she could change the world through hard work and good intentions. "What about you, Kash?" asked Tom. "What were you like as a kid?" Kash smiled and stared into the fire for a moment before answering. "I was probably too serious for my own good, always worrying about things, trying to figure out how the world worked and where I fit into it. Some things never change," joked Patricia, and everyone laughed. "Actually, that's not entirely true," Kash said thoughtfully. "I did change, but it took something pretty dramatic to shift my perspective." The group grew quiet, sensing that he was about to share something important. The fire popped and sparked, sending small embers up into the dark sky. "I went through a really difficult time when I was in college," Kash began, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "Everything I thought I knew about life got turned upside down. My parents were going through a messy divorce, I was struggling academically, and I felt completely lost." Karoline found herself leaning forward, drawn into his story. There was something in his voice that told her this wasn't just casual storytelling. This was real, and it had shaped who he became. "I remember one particular night when everything felt hopeless," Kash continued. "I was sitting alone in my dorm room, wondering if any of it mattered. My grades, my plans for the future, even my relationships with people. It all felt meaningless." The group listened intently. Even the people who knew Kash well seemed surprised by his openness. "I grew up going to church with my grandmother, but I had stopped paying attention to any of that when I got to college. I thought I had outgrown it, that it was just something for kids or people who couldn't think for themselves." He paused and took a sip of his coffee, gathering his thoughts. "But that night, when I felt like I had nowhere else to turn, I found myself remembering something my grandmother used to tell me about Jesus. She always said that Jesus had a special love for people who felt forgotten or lost." Karoline felt something stir inside her chest. She had been raised in a religious family too, but like Kash, she had drifted away from it as she got older and busier with her career. "I decided to go to the campus chapel, just to sit and think," Kash continued. "It was late at night and the place was empty except for me. I sat in one of the back pews and just let myself feel all the confusion and pain I had been trying to ignore." The fire crackled softly, and somewhere across the lake, a bird called out in the darkness. I don't know if you'd call it a prayer, or just talking to myself, but I started asking questions out loud. Why did life have to be so complicated? Why did good people suffer? What was the point of trying to do the right thing when everything seemed unfair? Karoline found her eyes filling with tears, though she wasn't sure why. Something about his honesty, his willingness to admit to the same doubts and fears that she wrestled with, touched her deeply. And then I remembered something else my grandmother used to say. She told me that Jesus didn't promise life would be easy, but he promised that no one had to face their struggles alone, that there was always love available, even in the darkest moments. Kash's voice grew softer, more personal. Sitting there in that empty chapel, I felt something I hadn't experienced before. It wasn't like a voice from heaven or anything dramatic, It was more like a quiet understanding that I mattered, that my struggles mattered, and that there was something bigger than my immediate problems. He looked around the fire at his friends, his eyes settling on Karoline for a moment before continuing. That night changed everything for me. Not because all my problems went away, but because I realized I didn't have to figure everything out on my own. I could trust that there was love and purpose even when I couldn't see it clearly. The group sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, processing what Kash had shared. It wasn't the kind of story people usually told at social gatherings, but somehow it felt exactly right for this moment. "That's beautiful," said Patricia quietly. "It takes courage to be that honest about struggling." "We all struggle," Kash replied. "I think the problem is that we're taught to hide it, especially in our line of work. We're supposed to have all the answers and never show weakness." Karoline wiped her eyes discreetly, hoping no one would notice how emotional she was getting. But Kash's story had hit her in a place she didn't even know was hurting. "The thing is," Kash continued, "once I stopped trying to be perfect and started accepting that it's okay to need help, everything became clearer. My work, my relationships, even my sense of purpose. It all made more sense when I stopped trying to control everything myself." "How do you mean?" asked David. "Well, take our jobs, for example. We work in government because we want to help people, right? But it's easy to get caught up in the politics and forget about the actual people we're supposed to serve." Kash stirred the fire with a long stick, sending more sparks into the night sky. "When I remember that every policy decision affects real families, real children, real people who are struggling just like I was that night in college, it changes how I approach everything. It's not about winning political games anymore. It's about being part of something bigger than myself." Karoline felt like he was speaking directly to her heart. This was exactly what she had been feeling but couldn't put into words. The sense that her work had lost its meaning, that she had gotten caught up in the day-to-day battles and forgotten why she started this journey in the first place. "That story about Jesus caring for forgotten people," she said quietly, surprising herself by speaking up. "I think I needed to hear that tonight." Kash looked at her with understanding in his eyes. "We all need reminders sometimes that we're not alone in this." The conversation continued late into the night, but something had shifted. The group felt closer, more connected. They talked about their hopes and fears, their dreams for the future, and the things that really mattered to them beyond their careers. As Karoline finally headed to her room in the guest house, she felt like something important had happened. She couldn't quite name it yet, but Kash's story had opened something in her heart that had been closed for a long time. For the first time in months, she felt like she might remember why she chose this path and find her way back to the person she used to be. The next morning at the lake house came with gentle sunlight streaming through the windows and the peaceful sound of water lapping against the shore. Karoline woke up feeling different somehow, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what had changed. The conversation from the night before kept playing in her mind, especially Kash's story about finding hope in that empty chapel. She made her way to the kitchen where Tom was already making coffee and preparing breakfast for everyone. The smell of bacon and fresh coffee filled the air, creating the kind of warm, homey atmosphere that made her wish she could stay here forever. "Good morning," Tom said with a smile. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in months," she replied honestly. "There's something about this place that just makes you feel peaceful." One by one, the other guests appeared and they all gathered around the large dining table for breakfast. The conversation was light and easy, with people sharing plans for the day and enjoying the relaxed pace that comes with being away from the city. Kash appeared last, looking refreshed and carrying a book under his arm. He greeted everyone warmly and took a seat across from Karoline. "What are you reading?" she asked, curious about the book he had brought. He held it up so she could see the cover. It was a simple paperback about finding purpose in difficult times. "I picked this up a few weeks ago," he said. "Sometimes I like to read things that remind me of what's really important, especially when work gets overwhelming." After breakfast, the group split up to enjoy different activities. Some people went for a walk around the lake. Others decided to take out the small boats that Tom kept at his dock. Karoline found herself drawn to the quiet deck that overlooked the water, where she could sit and think. She wasn't alone for long. Kash appeared with 2 cups of coffee and asked if he could join her. Of course, she said, grateful for the company. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the sunlight dance on the water. I wanted to thank you for sharing your story last night, Karoline said eventually. It meant more to me than you probably realize. Kash turned to look at her, his expression kind and interested. I'm glad it resonated with you. Sometimes we need to hear that other people have walked through dark valleys too. That's exactly it, she said, feeling encouraged to open up. I've been going through my own dark valley lately, but I've been trying to handle it all on my own. She took a sip of her coffee, gathering her courage to be as honest as he had been. For the past year, maybe longer, I've felt like I'm just going through the motions. I wake up, go to work, handle crisis after crisis, come home exhausted, and then do it all over again the next day. I keep telling myself that it's meaningful work, that I'm making a difference, but honestly, I'm not sure I believe that anymore. Kash listened without interrupting, his full attention focused on her words. When I first got into politics, I had such big dreams. I wanted to help people, to be part of positive change in the world. But somewhere along the way, it became just about surviving each day and looking good in the press. Her voice grew quieter as she continued. I've lost touch with my family. I don't have close friends anymore, and I can't remember the last time I did something just because it brought me joy. Everything has become about work and image and success. That sounds incredibly lonely, Kash said gently. It is lonely, she admitted, surprised by how good it felt to say it out loud. But I didn't realize how lonely until last night when you talked about feeling lost in college. I've been feeling lost for months, but I kept telling myself I was too busy to deal with it. They sat quietly for a moment, both looking out at the peaceful lake. Can I ask you something? Karoline said. Of course. When you were in that chapel, when you felt that sense of understanding you described, what exactly did that feel like? I mean, how did you know it was real and not just your imagination? Kash considered the question carefully. That's a great question, and I'm not sure I can explain it in a way that makes complete sense. It wasn't like hearing a voice or seeing a vision. It was more like a feeling of being known and accepted exactly as I was, with all my doubts and fears and mistakes. He paused, searching for the right words. You know how when you're really struggling with something, you feel like you have to put on a brave face for everyone around you? Like you can't let people see how scared or confused you really are? Karoline nodded. She knew that feeling all too well. Well, in that moment, I felt like I could stop pretending. I could be completely honest about how lost I felt, and instead of being judged for it, I was loved because of it. Does that make sense? Tears began to well up in Karoline's eyes. It makes perfect sense, she whispered. Kash continued, his voice growing more passionate as he spoke. That's what I think Jesus was really teaching when he talked about loving people who feel forgotten or broken. It wasn't just a nice philosophy. It was a promise that no matter how far we've drifted from who we want to be, we're still worthy of love and compassion. The tears that had been building in Karoline's eyes began to fall freely now. She tried to wipe them away discreetly, but Kash noticed. I'm sorry, she said, feeling embarrassed. I don't know why I'm getting so emotional. Don't apologize, he said kindly. Sometimes we need to cry about things we've been carrying for too long. It's just that, she struggled to find the words through her tears. Everything you're saying about being loved despite our flaws, about not having to pretend to be perfect all the time, it's exactly what I've been longing for without even knowing it. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and took a shaky breath. I've been so focused on being successful, on proving myself, on never showing weakness, that I forgot what it feels like to just be human. To admit that I don't have all the answers and that I need help sometimes. Kash reached across the small table between them and gently squeezed her hand. That's not weakness, Karoline, that's courage. It takes incredible strength to admit when you're struggling. The simple gesture of human kindness broke something open in Karoline's heart. The tears came harder now, not from sadness but from relief. It was as if she had been holding her breath for months and could finally exhale. "I don't even know what I'm crying about exactly," she said through her tears. "I think it's everything. The loneliness, the pressure, the feeling like I've lost myself somewhere along the way." "Maybe you're crying because you're remembering who you really are," Kash suggested softly. "Sometimes we have to grieve the person we became in order to find our way back to the person we're meant to be." They sat together in the morning sunshine, Karoline crying quietly while Kash offered silent support, simply by being present. Other guests walked by occasionally, but they gave the two of them space, somehow understanding that an important conversation was taking place. "You know what's strange?" Karoline said after her tears had slowed. "I feel embarrassed for crying, but I also feel lighter than I have in months, like I've been carrying a heavy weight and finally put it down." "That's not strange at all," Kash replied. "Sometimes tears are how our hearts clean house. They wash away the things we've been holding on to that we don't need anymore." "I used to pray when I was younger," Karoline said suddenly. "Not just in church, but really pray. Like I was talking to someone who cared about me and wanted to help me figure things out." "What happened to that?" Kash asked. "Life got complicated, work got demanding. I started thinking I was too smart or too sophisticated to need that kind of help anymore. But listening to your story last night, I realized how much I missed that feeling of not being alone in the world." She looked out at the lake, watching a family of ducks swim by peacefully. "I want to find my way back to that. Not just the praying part, but the whole thing. The sense of purpose. The feeling like my work matters for reasons beyond just career advancement. The ability to connect with people as human beings instead of just political contacts." "That's a beautiful desire," Kash said. "And I don't think it's as far away as you might think. Sometimes the journey back to ourselves starts with exactly what you're doing right now." "What do you mean?" "Being honest about where you are, admitting that you need help, and being open to the possibility that there's more to life than what you can see on the surface." As the morning continued, they talked about faith, purpose, and the challenge of staying true to yourself in a world that often rewards pretending to be someone you're not. It was the kind of deep, meaningful conversation that Karoline had been craving without realizing it. By the time they rejoined the rest of the group for lunch, something fundamental had shifted in Karoline's heart. She felt raw and vulnerable, but also hopeful in a way she hadn't experienced in a long time. The tears had been difficult, but they had also been healing. She knew that this conversation with Kash would stay with her long after they returned to Washington. Something about his willingness to share his own struggle and his genuine care for her journey had opened a door in her heart that had been closed for too long. The rest of that Sunday at the lake house passed like a gentle dream. After her emotional conversation with Kash on the deck, Karoline felt like she was seeing everything with new eyes. The sunlight on the water looked brighter. The laughter of her friends sounded warmer, and even the simple act of sharing a meal together felt more meaningful. During lunch, she found herself really listening to people's stories, instead of just waiting for her turn to speak. When Patricia talked about her daughter's school play, Karoline asked follow-up questions because she genuinely wanted to know more. When David mentioned his struggles with work-life balance, she offered support instead of trying to one-up him with her own busy schedule. It was as if the tears she had shed that morning had washed away a layer of armor she didn't even know she was wearing. She felt more present, more connected, more like herself than she had in months. As the afternoon wound down and people began packing up to head back to the city, Kash approached her one more time. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice full of genuine concern. "Different," she said honestly. "Raw, but in a good way. Like I've been living behind glass for so long that I forgot what fresh air felt like." He smiled. "That's exactly how I felt after my night in the chapel. Everything looked the same, but I was seeing it all differently." "Thank you," she said, meeting his eyes. "For sharing your story, for listening to mine, for not making me feel crazy for crying over things I couldn't even name." "Thank you for trusting me with your heart," he replied. "That takes real courage." The drive back to Washington was quiet and thoughtful. Karoline didn't turn on the radio or make phone calls to catch up on work. Instead, she let herself think about everything that had happened over the weekend. She thought about Kash's story, about her own tears, and about the possibility that her life could be different if she had the courage to change it. Monday morning came with the usual rush of meetings, phone calls, and urgent emails. But instead of diving headfirst into the chaos like she normally did, Karoline took a few minutes to sit quietly at her desk before starting her day. She thought about the conversation by the lake and tried to remember what it felt like to believe that her work could have deeper meaning. Her first meeting was with a group of policy advisors about education funding. Normally, she would have approached it as a political chess game, thinking about which positions would play well with different voter groups. But this time, she found herself thinking about actual children in actual schools, wondering how the decisions they made in that conference room would affect real families. "What do you think, Karoline?" her colleague asked, pulling her back into the discussion. "I think we need to remember that we're not just talking about budget numbers," she said. "We're talking about kids who need books and teachers and safe places to learn. Maybe we should start there and work backward to the politics." The room grew quiet for a moment. This wasn't the kind of thing people usually said in policy meetings. "That's a good point," said another advisor. "Sometimes we get so caught up in the strategy that we forget what we're actually trying to accomplish." The meeting continued, but with a slightly different tone. People asked more questions about real-world impact and fewer questions about political positioning. It was a small change, but Karoline felt it deeply. Over the next few days, she found herself approaching her work differently. Instead of just managing crises, she started asking why the crises existed in the first place. Instead of just crafting messages that sounded good, she tried to find messages that were actually true and helpful. The change didn't go unnoticed. Her assistant commented that she seemed calmer. Her colleagues mentioned that her ideas in meetings were more thoughtful. Even her boss noticed that her communications had more heart in them. But the biggest change was internal. Karoline felt like she was reconnecting with the person she used to be, the one who got into politics because she wanted to make a positive difference in the world. On Wednesday evening, she did something she hadn't done in years. She called her parents. "Karoline?" Her mother's voice was surprised but pleased. "What a wonderful surprise. How are you, honey?" "I'm good, Mom. Really good, actually. I wanted to call and just talk to you and Dad. I realized it's been way too long since we had a real conversation." They talked for over an hour, not about work or politics, but about family memories, about her parents' garden, about her brother's new baby, about all the ordinary precious things that make up a life. "You sound different," her father said near the end of the call. "Happier, maybe? More like the girl we used to know?" Tears sprang to Karoline's eyes, but they were good tears this time. "I think I'm finding my way back to her, Dad." That Friday, Kash sent her a text message. "How has your week been? Still thinking about our conversation?" She texted back immediately. "Life-changing, honestly. Would you like to get coffee this weekend? I'd love to tell you about it." They met at a small cafe in Georgetown on Saturday morning. It was the kind of place where you could talk for hours without feeling rushed, with comfortable chairs and the gentle hum of other conversations in the background. "You look different," Kash said as soon as he saw her. "More peaceful somehow." "I feel different," she replied. "That conversation we had by the lake, it started something in me that I can't stop in the best possible way." She told him about her week, about approaching her work with new questions, about calling her parents, about feeling like she was waking up from a long sleep. "I keep thinking about what you said about Jesus caring for people who feel forgotten," she said. "I realized that I had forgotten myself, if that makes sense. Not just forgotten who I was, but forgotten that I mattered as a person, not just as a job title." Kash nodded. "That's one of the hardest things about our kind of work. It's so easy to become what you do, instead of remembering that you're a human, being who happens to have a job." "Exactly. And I started thinking about the people we serve too. They're not just voters or demographics. They're people with hopes and fears and dreams just like us." "That changes everything, doesn't it?" Kash said. "When you see people as people instead of political considerations." "It really does. I gave a speech yesterday about healthcare policy, and instead of just talking about statistics and political positions, I told a story about a woman I met last year who couldn't afford her medication. The response was completely different. People were engaged instead of just politely listening. They talked for 2 hours, sharing ideas about how to bring more humanity into their work, how to stay connected to their deeper purpose, and how to support each other in remembering what really matters. I have a confession, Karoline said as they were getting ready to leave. I started praying again this week. Not formal church prayers, but just talking to God like I used to when I was younger. How does that feel? Kash asked. Like coming home, she said simply. Like remembering a friendship I thought I had lost. I'm so happy for you, he said, and she could tell he meant it deeply. As the weeks passed, Karoline continued to change. She started attending a small church near her apartment, not because she felt obligated, but because she genuinely wanted to explore this renewed sense of faith. She began volunteering at a local food bank on Saturday mornings, wanting to connect directly with the people her policy work was meant to help. Her relationships at work deepened too. People began coming to her not just for professional advice, but for personal support. She found herself having the kind of meaningful conversations she had shared with Kash with other colleagues who were struggling to find purpose in their demanding careers. Most importantly, she felt like herself again. The person who had gotten lost in the busyness and pressure of political life was finding her way back to the surface. She still worked hard and cared about doing a good job, but her identity was no longer completely wrapped up in her professional success. 3 months after that weekend at the lake house, Karoline was asked to speak at a conference for young people interested in public service. Instead of giving the usual advice about networking and career strategies, she told them about the importance of staying connected to their deeper purpose. Don't let the work change who you are, she said to the audience of eager young faces. Remember that you're not just building a career, you're building a life, and the best way to serve others is to remember that they're not just constituents or clients or problems to be solved. They're people, just like you, who deserve to be seen and heard and cared for. After her speech, a young woman approached her with tears in her eyes. Thank you, the woman said. I was starting to wonder if it was possible to work in politics and still be a good person. You gave me hope that it is. Karoline hugged her, remembering her own moment of tears by the lake, and how Kash's story had given her the same kind of hope. It's not only possible, she told the young woman. It's essential. The world needs people who remember that politics is supposed to be about serving others, not just advancing ourselves. That night, as Karoline reflected on how much her life had changed since that emotional morning by the lake, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Not just for Kash's willingness to share his story, but for all the moments and people and experiences that had brought her back to herself. She had learned that sometimes the most important conversations happen when you least expect them, and that opening your heart to another person's truth can open doors in your own life that you didn't even know were closed.